Hello, BookTube, and welcome back to your Daily Penguin, what Hannah at Hannah's Books calls my March of the Penguins, where we are going through my Penguin classics, one book at a time, one author at a time. And we are in the ancient world, still and for a while, and today we're dealing with a biggie, in all senses of the word. Not only for a large amount that comes to us in fairly good form, not, in other words, we're not talking this time around about a narrow textual survival, although we are very much talking about a pitiless ratio, but also in terms of influence, as we've already seen with some videos that we've had in the series so far, and that is the Roman historian Livy. Roman here as an honorific, Roman here by a kind of generous inclusion. Livy was from modern-day Padua, and it sounded in his voice. the historian who's also come up on this channel, Licinius Pollio, referred to the fact that not only did Livy sound like he was from Padua, but he kind of wrote like he was as well. And that is just a dig. That is a slight dig at a kind of gesture of provincial moralism. And that definitely comes through in Livy's work, which is one work. He was from Padua, but he came to Rome, and he was born in 59 BC. He died in AD 17, and he spent almost all of that time in Rome, and he spent it working on one book, a book from the founding of the city, from a history of Rome, from its very earliest founding, the mythopoetic, the mytho-folklore of Romulus and Remus, all the way to his present day. An epic undertaking. As far as we know, he never did anything else. Never was an advocate in the law courts, never stood for any Roman offices, never ran for any campaigns, never served in any kind of military. As far as we know, all he did was work on this book for his entire life, or his entire adult life, 40 years or more. Was famous for it, was oft quoted as sections of his work, what classical scholarship refers to as books of the whole. We can refer to them more as sections, so as not to be confusing. As sections of the whole were written, they would sometimes be copied in fine and in multiple copies, circulated in Samizdat, sometimes sold, often attended as readings. Well known. Those segments, and they would grow as the work got longer, were promulgated all over the Roman world and were beloved. They were loved for reasons that we're going to get into, to such an extent that Livy himself, the person, was almost a tourist attraction. People were curious. People in Rome were curious if this is where Livy is. Is there a chance that we'll see him? Is there a chance that we can meet him? Literary parvenus from parts of Italy and corners of the empire always wanted to meet him. The more literary folk always did. They always wanted to angle to see if they could get a chance to talk to him at a reading or after a reading, a chance to invite him to their home, offer him a great meal and maybe a gift as he's leaving, that sort of thing. In other words, he was a literary star. And he wrote a book. Every introduction to Penguin Classic, to Livy, or anything else will always mention this, and this is where the pitiless ratio comes in, because when he was done with his book, Ab Urbe Condita, when he was done with his book From the Founding of the City, it was 147 of those segments long, and 35 of them survive. 35. The vast amount of his book does not survive, including, horrifically, huge chunks about his own present day, or the things leading up to his own present day. He lived through some epic events. He knew better than anyone that they were epic, and he could put them in context, and we don't have any of it. And every time there is a document discovered, every time there is a library uncovered, everyone hopes, I firmly believe, everyone has their favorite classical authors, Greek or Roman, or otherwise. I firmly believe that whenever any kind of trove is even hinted at, the first thing that anyone thinks is, oh, wouldn't it be great if we got all the rest of Livy? Wouldn't it be great if we did? Because only a tiny fraction of him survives. And that wouldn't be so big a deal if the tiny fraction that survives wasn't so good. But it is really, really good. That is what I meant by the source of its appeal. because Livy has two things that attach to that appeal. One is that kind of, he played it for effect, a kind of a pseudo hayseed, rough-hewn morality that says the world is decadent and falling apart, but it wasn't once that way. And if you think back in your heart or in your own past, if you're old enough, you'll remember when the world made more sense, when right and wrong were clearly delineated and a man's word was worth something. And telling the story of Rome is a way for me to bring those stories back to your attention and also chart a kind of gradual degradation. That, as a narrative scheme, is never, in fact, factually true, but oh, does it have appeal, even to me. Even if you see what it is, it still has an appeal, an enormous one. And Livy knew how to use that. That was one element. The second element was his skill as a writer, which is, I believe, unparalleled. I don't think anyone in the ancient world is any better, even Plutarch. I don't think anyone in the ancient world is any better than Livy is at writing rip-snorting great historical fiction, what we would consider today historical fiction. Livy had tons of primary sources open to him. Every library in Rome, every library in the major provinces were honored. By the time he was 10 years at this book, any one of them would have been honored to show him anything, allow him to take books home, allow him to copy anything that he wants. He had access to everything that would have made a history in the sense that we understand the term. And I want to stress again that we only understand that term in common usage comparatively recently. It's largely a gift of 19th century German academics. There were bits and pieces before then, but it's the idea that history is what you can prove, and that if it's not, then you can't prove it. If you can't document it, then you don't include it. And if there's a legend that documents it, then you include the legend as a legend. That you're not supposed to pursue any kind of ideological thing. You're just supposed to describe what happened in eloquent and insightful terms. You're supposed to be objective, in other words, in terms of your historiography, in terms of your epistemology. All of that is a legacy of a fairly modern vintage. Michelet's enormous, great history of the French Revolution. Thomas Carlyle's enormous, great history of the French Revolution, and a ton of other things do not largely abide by that. The author doesn't want to be caught in an obvious fallacy. The author obviously doesn't want to be laughed at as a credulous dupe. But nevertheless, there's a way to write history that has gone now. No one writes it this way anymore. And if they try to, it's either edited out of them or they're mocked for it by the time it gets to the modern world. Even today, in 2020, there's still a bit of scorn in the industry, especially among professional historians, for so-called popular historians. That's existed for a long time. I remember encountering that in the history faculty at college when I brought up Barbara Tuchman's name. And you could tell that a large part of it was that the people I was talking to, the academic historians that I was talking to, had never sold 1 million copies of a book. Livy did the equivalent of that. But there was no one around to say that was the wrong way to do it. He was the best at doing history the way history was done then. And the way it was done then was, okay, I've consulted all of these primary texts about the Battle of Trebia or Cannae. I've consulted all of the texts. I've read them all. I've taken notes on all of them. So I know what all of the contemporary documents that chronicle that event say. Here's my version. I'm going to take all of those events and I'm going to meld them together into a version that I like. And on the eve of battle and during strategy sessions and whatnot, I'm going to tell you what the generals and their subordinates said. When there's no record of that. There's no record whatsoever. Here's what they said. And what I'm going to do, what Livy did, and he wasn't the only one by far. We saw Appian. Appian does this all the time. There are plenty of other people that do. Even Tacitus, who is largely regarded as the sort of antithesis of this approach, even he does the same thing. It's the famous speeches. Whenever you talk about a Roman historian, you're going to hear about speeches, although they didn't invent them. Herodotus and Thucydides were doing it long before. The speeches will come up when you talk about Livy. And that the speeches are a shorthand for that when Livy gets to a certain point, he not only gives a character 2 pages of a speech on some subject or other, but it's soaringly beautiful. just soaringly incredible. The speeches in Livy are the best part of him, even though they're the part most quickly disparaged by modern historians today. And not even modern historians. The historians have been harsh on Livy for a long time. And I guess it's understandable because we don't do that anymore. We don't do that anymore. No one, of course, no one. You'd ruin your own career if you did that. You can speculate on what someone said at a certain key event, but you can't invent words for them, especially since your audience is going to know you're doing that. Livy's audience knew. Only the most naive among his audience thought that the long speeches that he was pulling out of people's mouths in the age of Romulus and Remus were anything that ever actually was said. Most of his readers knew otherwise. They knew that when they got to a speech like that or a moment like that, they were encountering a dramatic reconstruction. And they read it for that. The sophistication of the general Roman reader, I think, has been serially misunderstood, underestimated, especially by professional readers. If you get into that mind frame, then Livy is a gift from the gods. He's absolutely incredible. I've had a couple of people in my life, I've recommended Livy, of course, forever. And I've had a couple of people in my life, most people get to him, they say, well, what volume should I read? And I say, well, you should. Penguin Classic does 4 volumes. The early history of Rome. This is the beginning of Livy's histories. Then Rome and Italy. Then Rome and the Mediterranean. And then the war with Hannibal. And I always tell people, you should read the War with Hannibal. Read the Penguin Classic volume of the War with Hannibal. And people always say, oh no, I should start at the beginning. I shouldn't jump in. I should start at the beginning. I say, all right, I warned you. And they stop. Because they don't know what to do with what they're encountering. It's not historical fiction in the sense they understand it, and it's not history in the sense they understand it, so they stop. Only a couple of times in all those decades have I had someone approach Livy correctly the first way, which is to approach it as the Romans did, where you're getting a historical narrative, you're getting a historical melodrama. It would be insulted if you called it fiction. It's never going to confess to its fictionalizing. But it's not what we consider history. It's a historical melodrama in the Roman mode. And when people encounter Livy that way, my old friend Deb was a surprising and perfect example of that, they fall in love immediately. They fall in love immediately. They see immediately what's going on, and that they've never encountered it done better. And that's what you get. That's what you get in the tiny amount of Livy that we still have. You get that. The Penguin Classic, the early history of Rome, and I believe Rome and Italy are both translated by Betty Radis, who was the heart and soul of Penguin Classics for a long time, and who is brilliant. These translations do not need updating. They do not need fixing. They do not need brushing and tidying. They are brilliant. And then Rome and the Mediterranean, I think, is a translation by Henry Bettinson. I'm not really sure if this is still the one they use. And I'm also not sure if Rome and Italy and Rome and the Mediterranean are even printed at all. Early history of Rome, yes, because you get Romulus and Remus, you get the expulsion of the kings, the Tarquins, you get all of that, all the famous Roman stuff, the famous Roman urban mythology you get. These are consuls, minor wars, civil war in Italy. This is not marquee Roman stuff, and a wonk of history might love these things, and a fan of classical literature will love that we have them. But these mass markets are byproducts of a much more optimistic time. These are from the 1950s, when the average reader might be expected to be interested in such things and slog through them. And also there was a prosperous market in schools. Whereas I don't know that that's true now. I have no idea. You'll notice I don't have any trade paperbacks here. I don't know what Penguin currently makes for the other books of Livy. I know for sure that they still print The War with Hannibal. I don't know how true it is. This translation is by Aubrey de Selincourt, and it is one of my favorite Penguin Classic volumes of them all. This is Livy's account of the famous Second Punic War, and Aubrey de Selincourt translates it beautifully, largely by doing the version of translating that I mentioned earlier when it came to Robert Graves translating Suetonius, which is that de Selincourt knew the passages of Livy and knew his Latin so well that he could sort of closely read a section of a section, a tiny chapter of a tiny chapter, and then go out walking the field, go use book hunting, muse in bed, sit out on the lawn, and cogitate, and then sit down and write an English version of that thing. So in other words, often not with any kind of classically vetted Oxford Latin text in front of him. Often not that. Instead, a translation in the much more full sense of the word. And the result in this case is wonderful. It's just wonderful. It acknowledges, to a certain extent, that almost unparalleled, maybe Cicero, but almost unparalleled is Livy's ability to draw out of Latin things that cannot be translated into English. Not directly. So the conscientious translator will simply give up that aim and instead try to come close to the spirit, to the reason why so many thousands of people read and loved Livy over the centuries. And Aubrey de Selincourt, I think, does that better than even Betty Radis. I have a feeling that if this... I don't think Penguin would ever abandon the de Selincourt translation of War with Hannibal. I don't think anyone else would take it on. Somebody did it for the Oxford World Classics. But it's nowhere near as piquant and conversational. It's nowhere near as that. It's a very good volume, but it's what we really need is a landmark Livy, a landmark War with Hannibal in a big volume with the Selincourt translation and tons of maps. Maybe someday. but in the meantime, I'd be hard pressed to believe that Penguin Classic wouldn't update this a bit. I'm fairly certain that they would. And I'm kind of glad that I don't know what that is and that I've never read it, because I love the original. Just love the original. This was a book that I brought with me all over the world. Even though I can read the original, I'm so in love with the translation that I brought it with me everywhere and dearly, dearly loved it. And that is the Penguin Classic Livy. It's 4 volumes. And you get pretty much everything that we still have. And that is going to bring us to a familiar complaint. I'm never going to talk about Livy again on this channel, so I might as well voice that complaint, which is that if you can see over my shoulder that Penguin Classic has many, many times in its history done gigantic 1,200, 1,300, even 1,500 page trade paperbacks. If they can do that for other people, if they can do that for the Mysteries of Paris, then they can do that for Livy. And call it From the Founding of the City, and make it in a nice deluxe Penguin Classic 1 volume that has all of it. You can still use these translations. You can still break it up on the inside of the book, give it French flaps, give it a new cover design, go on Tumblr and find somebody who's willing to do a cover design for very cheap. Find somebody who's willing to write a new introduction that conveys the wonder and the joy of Livy. It's possible you could find somebody to do that for free. And another design quirk that I think would work really well would be to put all sorts of blurbs on the back like it was a new book. Livy is, not only has he been thunderously panned by Thomas Macaulay, who's a great historian in his own right, who says that Livy doesn't care about the truth. A blatant canard. That is absolutely not true. But that is a famous Macaulay quote, and there are others. But Livy is also the only author that you could possibly make a big fat trade Penguin paperback where you would get a pan from the Emperor Caligula, who didn't like Livy and left a bad review. That would be hilarious. That would bring it alive. And you could select, there are a handful of classicists who've written really good 1 or 2 sentence blurbs about Livy, positive or negative. Put those on the back and give us a 1-volume Livy. You can see on the shelf up above me, if you look really hard, you can see the Domesday Book. This doesn't even have a narrative. It's just a census. Penguin made that, and they made it in a lovely edition. We're going to get to it. But not Livy. For Livy, you need this. It's not the same violence as was done to Plutarch, where the carving up was done totally against the idea of the work itself. Livy, after all, did produce these things in segments, and often published them individually in segments. It's not quite as much of a violence, but it's all we have of Livy. Why is this cast off into 4 volumes? Why not 1? Why not all we have of Livy in 1 book? It would be possible, and I would like it if Penguin would do that. But in the meantime, we have these 4. And I have read these 4, despite the fact that I love to spend time in Livy's company directly with his Latin. I have read these translations many, many times, and I've bought them many times, handed them to many, many people, and I recommend them to you. And I hope that you won't be a stickler the way my friends have been. Start with the War with Hannibal. Just dive right into that. If it not because that has Hannibal, it has elephants, it has major battles, it has high personalities, great drama. Livy rises to the occasion, and it will keep you reading because of the extra dramatic nature of the events. And it will also give you a perfect opportunity, a painless opportunity to know whether or not what Livy's doing sits well with you. And if it does, you've got the other 3 volumes to read. At least then you'll know, and you won't have to suffer with who's that again? What's this again? Because the War with Hannibal is intrinsically interesting. And there you go. that is your Daily Penguin, one of my favorite authors from the classical period. What little we have left of Livy, I could not live without him. And I think I might postpone your Daily Penguins until Monday. Is that going to cause howls of outrage? I think I might postpone them and just not do one on Saturday and Sunday. It was an idea that I had. I don't really have a particular reason for it. I just thought you might be getting tired of Daily Penguins. So I guess I'll find out one way or another. I'll cast around and see. I was thinking we might resume on Monday with someone else. But I'm going to wrap this up for now. But I'll be back. Thank you, BookTube.